Welcome to eSports Hero Café, where we talk about any and all esports. I'm your host, Bowman Shota, and today we have a very special guest. We have with us Alex Fletcher, who's the CEO and founder of Entiva Group, which is an esports strategy consulting firm. But Alex, how you doing today?
Good, man. How's it going?
Very good, very good. So we have a interesting topic. We're going to be kind of speculating and future casting a little bit with this topic. We're going to dive into franchising and how it can impact the esports scene and how it could be set up possibly. And we'll kind of do some real life sports comparisons and everything. But before we dive into all that, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into esports.
Well, I've been involved in esports professionally for the last, 4+ years, and I started just randomly. I've been a gamer my whole life, an athlete also, but an associate of mine pulled me in to help him recruit some staff for his firm in around 2012, and I had no idea what esports was at that time, and I kind of just fell head first, and I've been here ever since.
Nice. All right. Now, if you want to just do a little plug real quick for you. I first heard of you through your Tiny Letter, actually, which is at tinyletter.com/afletcher. Anyone out there, it's a great newsletter, would you call it, I guess?
Yeah, it's a newsletter. We focus on the industry side of esports, so for anyone looking for the fun pieces, unfortunately we're covering like the boring business stuff there. But if you're interested in keeping track with that, I suggest any and everyone subscribe to it.
Nice. Yes, I do look forward to reading that when those come out. So, all right, well, let's dive into what franchising is, and just to kind of clarify, as far as definition for the viewers, we're talking about for like in a specific esport, like we'll take League of Legends for example, to where for the NALCS they have currently 10 teams that are qualified, and if franchising was implemented, what we're saying is those 10 teams would never change. There'd be no way for those teams to be replaced, and all players would have to then be drafted or qualified onto those teams. And that's the type of franchising we're talking about. We're not talking about Team Liquid by itself and how they have teams in multiple games. Like, that's a separate definition of franchising. We're talking about like a set in stone, kind of like the NFL, where the Chicago Bears, even if they lose every game, are always going to be a franchise of the NFL. So, so first off, how can you give a definition, Alex, of why you think franchising would be a good thing going forward?
Well, that's a great question, and you pointed out a definition of franchising or franchises in traditional sports, and I think in esports, the notion of franchising can and it should be different, in the sense that traditional sports are really heavily based on regional affinity, right? Place, location. You mentioned the Chicago Bears. That team is based in Chicago for now. A franchise basically provides the owners of that team, a right, basically a right to participate in the league itself, right? And should the owners decide that they want to pick up and move their team from Chicago to Florida, they're able to do that. In esports, it's a little different, and I think that because there isn't that strong hold on a specific place and region for teams, that the notion of franchising, while it could be helpful in the way that it's implemented in traditional sports, if it is to move into the esports world, there should be a number of differences to account for the disparity between physical sports and esports.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that to where, I gave my first example I talked about in the NALCS, if those 10 teams could never change. Now, personally, I think that wouldn't be a good system, because there's lots more League of Legends teams than just those 10, obviously. And another real-life example would be like the Barclays Premier League for football, soccer, whatever you call it, depending on which continent you're in, to where they have the top teams in the Premier League, and then they actually have a championship league that's below that. And I think it's the bottom 3 or 4 teams of the Premier League automatically get regulated to the championship league, and the top 3 or 4 teams from the championship league automatically the next season go into the Premier League, and it's based on points. And so that's a way, like if we were to compare that to, we'll keep rolling with the League of Legends example, to the NALCS and like their Challenger series, to where both are at the pro level, but one's at the top tier competition, and then the other one would be almost like a feeder league, essentially, to where like it's for growing teams and stuff like that. But since there's a set structure, and those teams are set in stone to a point as well, it'd be easier for advertisers and everything like that to get in that structure. That's just a thought on mine. I mean, what do you think about how the Barclays League sets up their stuff?
No, I think that's a great parallel. And see, I'm not I'm a horrible gamer, but I'm not a former pro or a high-level amateur player at all. And I'm not an expert in what it takes to, for example, play at the highest level of any video game title. At the same time, I think regulation, and that's what you mentioned with the Barclays League in Europe I think that has a place in esports. And I think the reason that it does have a place, regardless of any introduction of franchising, is that at this given juncture in the life cycle of competitive gaming at the professional level, you need a certain amount of turnover. To go back to that example about the National Football League, which is America's version of football, the league structure, the league product is a lot more evolved and mature than something like even the the LCS, right, across the board. And so I don't think that getting rid of, totally striking away relegation in all forms is the best way. I think there's a way to balance the scales. There's a way to introduce the notion of franchises to some extent without killing or without killing regulation totally. And that might sound like that's contradictory, but I think the good thing about esports is that it's a relatively new domain, and it makes a perfect backdrop for experimenting with maybe hybrid or new models.
Yeah, and to kind of feed off your point real quick, the only reason the NFL doesn't need a relegation is because there's such a endemic structure from primary school to high school to college with the athletics programs and all of those that feed right into the professional scene.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's, as I talked to Tyler Schroet last week about collegiate esports. Like, it's a news upcoming scene, but it's not to the level to where it could become a feeder scene yet. I mean, it may be down the road. I don't know if it's a YouTube show from Rocket Jump called Video Game High School. They set it up to where like they actually have like competitive leagues and high schools play high schools. It's, if you're bored, check it out. It's actually a really cool series. But the structure they set up, we don't have that right now. As far as we don't have high school teams playing each other in an organized fashion. We don't have college teams. I know we have Heroes of the Dorm, which was on ESPN2, which was great. But even that itself, is in a limited scope essentially. So let's take League of Legends for example, to kind of kick off this first part. How would you implement franchising into League of Legends?
Well, I would do it in a very measured approach, and like they say, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not Riot Games, so I don't have any authority on it. I think that the best way to roll something like that out is to, like I said, avoid sweeping changes. You really alluded to the key factor in any change like franchising in any game, especially or specifically with League of Legends, and that's a lack of an ecosystem, right? So Riot does a great job of managing basically a closed network of professional play, right?
Yeah.
But there's nothing that really there's no symbiotic relationship between that and any other level of play, right? They have the challenger scene, but once again, that's really tightly controlled, and I think there needs to be not experimentation, but you have to be very careful about trying to grab models that work in traditional sports and apply them wholesale to esports, because what ends up happening is, while there are a lot of similarities in the case that we just mentioned, there are a lot of differences that really make for some potentially some potential pitfalls. So if I were in any position of authority, I would take a very measured approach to it. But I do think that, the notion of franchising, of franchises and franchises will and should be a part of the future of esports in some form or the other.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And it's interesting because, I personally think franchising would help the scene explode, which I'll dive into a little bit later as far as the sponsors and everything. But I also think from a player standpoint, it would provide a stability on their end, and also teams would be more willing to invest long term in their players with proper physical training, as we've talked about. Because look at Counter-Strike, you have a couple top 5 players who can't even play in tournaments right now because they have wrist or hand injuries. Teams would be more willing to put money into that versus right now the average pro player length is so short. I don't blame them for not investing that type of money into it. And then you're also going to have better with franchising if you always have the set teams. Investors and advertisers know that they're going to have a better guarantee on ROI, on return on investment. For League of Legends specifically, I think something similar to the Barclays Premier League structure would be good. I personally think there needs to be more games per split. I think of from the viewer standpoint, you tune in to watch your favorite team, but you don't want to tune in for a half hour to 45 minutes to watch them play once. You want to, a traditional sports match lasts a couple hours, and so if you really enforce franchising, you start getting those fans, like you have the Chicago Bears fans and Detroit Lions fans and stuff, and viewer numbers will go up and also merchandising will go up in that. And I may be rambling a little bit, but
yeah, no, I definitely hear you in there. If we're gonna eventually talk about the marketing, the sponsorship, and investment aspect of it, there are a number of different angles that franchising can and will affect along those lines. So when we get to that, that'll be a really cool part of the show, I think.